As James Dean was to the movie world, Jackson Pollock was to American art.
He had this kind of screw you attitude, and this was not what people expected from artists.
Pollock spent his life wrestling with inner demons.
I think he was tortured in many ways.
Pouring his psyche out in paint, he redefined Western art and drowned his self-doubt in drunken binges. Then fame struck.
He was so desperate for it, wanted it so much, and when he got it, he realized how empty it was.
And it took away everything he cherished.
I don't think he intended to kill anybody else in the car. The person he wanted to kill was himself.
For the artist, it would all end in darkness, but his art would endure for the ages. The triumph of Jackson Pollock, now on Biography.
In 1949, Life magazine ran an article with a headline that screamed, "Is Jackson Pollock the greatest living painter in the United States?"
And when he first started getting covered in places like Time and Life, I think there was a little bit of a circus show aspect to it. Like, ha ha, isn't this funny that art critics are saying that this crazy young guy is the greatest living American painter?
5 million copies of the magazine hit the stands, forever altering the life of this obscure painter working quietly in his barn.
This was an unprecedented kind of exposure for a young, virtually unknown artist, somebody whose work was controversial and very frequently misunderstood and misinterpreted.
An unlikely genius whose struggle to draw had changed the rules of modern art.
He's the one who pulls all these strands together and comes up with something that works as art.
Was Life overstating the story or foretelling the future of American art?
That really was an incredibly powerful phrase and played a big role in the public recognition of abstract expressions.
Life magazine had a huge circulation, and it was the equivalent in those days of what, say, People magazine would be today.
Life magazine's nod to his mastery was a shock to everyone, including Pollock.
And he was thrilled. I mean, as any artist would be. I mean, he ordered a bunch of copies, and when they arrived in the mail, he was busy sending them home to Mom to prove to her that he really was something other than a screw-up.
This was the fulfillment of the 37-year-old artist's lifelong dream.
People think that if you take some paint and drip it on a canvas, you come out with something really energetic and exciting. And you can try this yourself at home. The problem is, if you keep on working, you just end up with a big, flat, boring, static mess. And the thing that is so astounding about the great Pollocks is that they are full of energy, and that is really kind of a miracle.
But Jackson would pay a terrible price for this moment of fame.
Fame, if it's bought into, and celebrity, if it's paid attention to in any way, is really a great destroyer of the creative process, you know, and of people's instinctive need to create.
Jackson Pollock could create, but was totally unprepared for the public spotlight. For one thing, he wasn't a talker.
Pollock wasn't a very verbal person. It's one of the things I really liked about him.
How are you? Well, fine. How are you? It was like talking to a dry cracker.
He could be charming, but there was a dark side, too.
The charm was mixed with a very ugly side to his personality. The side that could insult women, the side that would provoke fights, the side that landed him in the gutter, drunk for a while.
The charm and the anger and the resentment, all, and the misbehavior, really were two sides of the same coin. He figured out when to put on the charm and when he needed to throw a fit in order to get attention.
Before Life magazine thrust him into prominence in 1949, Jackson had spent a dozen years in New York, alternating between painting and binge drinking.
It appears to have been something like a borderline schizophrenia, according to some of his psychiatrists. But it was very difficult to even address the psychological dimension of the problems because they couldn't get him to stop drinking first.
And then at age 30, he was rescued by a gifted painter, Lee Krasner.
Lee Krasner called him the sexiest thing on two legs.
And here was a woman who, first of all, put up with him. Second of all, really appreciated his art.
She was 100% for him as an artist. And she was simply willing to take on the problems that she knew very well she would have to deal with.
She pulled Pollock from the gutter and set him on the road to success, but she put her own career on the back burner in the process.
The overwhelming feeling and compassion that she had for Jackson was that of a child. And you don't abandon or ditch your child, no matter what.
Lee got his art seen by all the right people.
Lee was a very good manager, and she knew a lot of the people in the art world, people with whom he had not yet had contact. And so she was able to kind of network for him.
And the world opened up to him.
Jackson Pollock was the artist who made Americans, the larger American public, aware that something important and exciting was happening in American art.
And by 1948, with Lee's help, Pollock had stopped the drinking binges that had nearly destroyed his life and talent.
Lee Krasner created those moments, those hours, those days when he had enough sobriety to create those masterpieces.
When he discovered his drip technique, or not necessarily when he discovered it, but when he began to commit himself to it and really take it as far as he could, it must have been quite freeing.
Pollock found a way to work paint that was controlled but free, working to the edges of his canvas and beyond.
Sometimes he would take a stick and just be slowly, carefully dripping off the end of it. At other times, he would charge up the stick with a lot of paint and go splat, and put down a big puddle of paint and things would go shooting off.
Some would call it chaos, but an influential critic, Clement Greenberg, thought it was breakthrough genius.
Then, with Greenberg's announcement that Jackson was the greatest living American artist, or possibly could be, Life magazine gives him his own article.
The 1949 Life magazine article changed everything overnight. Pollock's artist friends became competitors.
I mean, the other artists resented it. They didn't think he was the greatest living artist. They thought they were the greatest living artist.
His fame was as much Lee's achievement as his, but she began to chafe at all the praise. She'd brought the world to their door to see his work and found no one wanted to look at hers.
He was not at all comfortable with there being a second painter in the house.
As his fame spread, Jackson worried, could he live up to his sky-high reputation? What if his critics were right and he really was a fraud?
There were times when he was convinced that he'd finished a painting, that it was a great masterpiece, and that it blew Picasso out of the water. There were great moments when he felt that, but most of the time he would turn to Lee Krasner and say, "Is this a painting?"
Fame deepened Pollock's struggle with the old demons, his self-doubt, his fear of being second-rate. Jackson Pollock, the man who would redefine modern art, was born in the Rocky Mountains early in the 20th century. He was far from the center of the art world, but he would change all that.
Jackson Pollock is thought of as the great cowboy artist who came from the West, and that was a myth that was extremely helpful in presenting him to a public that really wasn't all that interested in art.
Pollock was born in Buffalo Bill's own town of Cody, Wyoming, on January 28, 1912. As an adult, he wore cowboy boots and played the harmonica badly. But the real Jackson, hiding behind the image, was a needy child who never was comfortable in his own skin, as an early letter makes clear.
People have always frightened and bored me. Consequently, I have been within my own shell.
Jackson's unstable childhood gave him little security, but a lot of drive.
I think the two most important things about Jackson's childhood were obviously his mother and his brothers, being the last of 5 brothers, and being the son of a mother who, she was really a woman of cosmopolitan ambitions and artistic ambitions for herself and for her children.
His mother was much stronger than his father. He was afraid of his mother.
If a child is extremely needful and needs huge amounts of maternal affection, which Jackson above all did, he wasn't going to ever get that from Stella Pollock. What he would get was her fierceness and her commanding presence.
Early on, Jackson accidentally found a dramatic way of getting attention.
When he's very young, he was chopping wood or something, or chopping on a tree stump. But in any case, he did sever, I think, the first joint of his finger.
And of course, he became the focus of attention for the whole family. It was the first time they'd ever taken a child to the doctor, was when this happened to Jackson. So, it worked in terms of bringing attention to him and giving him a place among the older, the older boys in the community.
In the teens and 20s, the Pollock family moved around the West.
His dad was a Scrabble farmer in rural places in Arizona and California, and they moved around, like, I think, 6 times in his first 8 years.
His father kept changing jobs. He was rather itinerant. And the father was something of a failure and was quite a heavy drinker.
When he was 8, his father abandoned the family. He would cycle in and out of his sons' lives for years more. But in his absence, Jackson turned to his brothers as surrogate fathers. One of Jackson's older brothers, Charles, would have a profound influence on him.
His older brother painted, and he got a lot of attention from his mother, and Jackson obviously wanted attention desperately for his whole life. So he began to dabble in it and paint.
Sandy, the brother who was closest to Jackson, once said that if Charles had been a tennis player or a plumber, Jackson Pollock would have been a tennis player or a plumber. There is no doubt that he became an artist because older brother Charles was an artist. Before he could become the greatest painter in the world, Jackson Pollock had to become the greatest painter in the Pollock family.
In addition to trying to earn his mother's favor by copying his older brother, who clearly is the mother's favorite, he's also got a father who's very taciturn, very uncommunicative. And he needs to earn the father's favor. And the father, of course, is very much a man's man. Jackson's really caught between trying to please his mother with artistic behavior on the one hand and trying to please his father with this sort of macho behavior on the other hand.
In his early teens, Jackson found a worrisome escape from his torments. While working with a surveying crew in the summer, he began to drink. 1 or 2 drinks changed his personality. The shy, quiet boy turned into an aggressive wild man.
I think his dad had an alcohol problem. Could have been, partially genetic. But it's, it's also, people find things to use. People find addictions to help them get through, especially when they feel they don't fit.
The family moved to Los Angeles, and Jackson enrolled in the famed Manual Arts High School, where he tried to learn to draw.
Jackson faced a whole series of challenges as an adolescent, one of them being that he wanted to be a painter, had decided that was what he should be, but he had very little technical skill.
He described his frustration in a letter to his brother Charles.
My drawing is rotten. It seems to lack freedom and is cold and lifeless. It isn't worth the postage to send it.
Among his peers, Jackson felt like an outsider.
Jackson had a very difficult high school experience. He was a big guy, and they wanted him to play football, and he didn't want to play football. So he was picked on, and he was roughed up, and they stuck his head in the toilet.
He described his state of mind in another letter.
This so-called happy part of one's life, youth, to me it's a bit of damnable hell. My mind blazes up with some illusion for a couple of weeks, and it smolders down to a bit of nothing.
Adolescence is an age in which we try to come to terms with who we are. And one of Jackson's principal issues was that he never did that. He had not resolved the various elements of his personality. He really didn't know who he was. And that's a very difficult thing.
Kicked out of school several times for disciplinary problems, Jackson was booted again in 1930.
He was just more this inarticulate rage that was striking out at whatever was in front of him.
There was nothing to hold him back when he decided to strike out for New York, to join his successful brother Charles and to study art.
So here was Jackson, full of ambition, with none of the tools that are normally considered essential to becoming a successful, let alone a great artist. And that had to be challenging.
No one could imagine then that only 20 years later, this kid who couldn't draw would change the face of modern art. In New York in 1930, the market had crashed and unemployment was high, but the big city's heart was not yet broken, and its energy dazzled young Jackson Pollock when he arrived.
Pollock came to New York in 1930. He was 18 years old, and he came specifically to study with Thomas Hart Benton at the Art Students League.
Jackson moved into his brother Charles's apartment and signed up to study with Charles's teacher, Thomas Hart Benton, a leading representational artist.
And he was famous for his lack of talent. There's an interview by a guy who was a student with him at school who said, Jackson struggled harder than anyone else with the paint and brushes, and he always lost. That's not quite fair. On the other hand, at that point, he was not as good as his brother.
Benton was what became known as a regionalist. He was teaching his students to use American scene subject matter.
The foul-mouthed, boisterous Benton bonded with his rather similar student.
Benton was a very heavy drinker, and Jackson partially modeled himself after Benton.
He went on vacations with Benton and with Rita. He babysat their son, TP, and at a time when Jackson desperately needed to belong and desperately needed to feel favored, this was an important favor.
Benton would say, "You've got the stuff, kid. I really believe in you." So he was very supportive of him as an artist.
The downside was that in the turbulent politics of the art world, which existed then as now, the kind of art that Benton was pushing, namely regionalism, was seen as incredibly old-fashioned, and Jackson had tied himself to the old just as the new was beginning.
In Pollock's earliest work, where you can see the Benton influence very strongly, there's also another more emotional undercurrent, more turbulent in a way, more subjective.
Benton was only a stand-in for the absent father Jackson still missed. When his real father died suddenly in 1933, Jackson fell into a deep depression. His brother Charles often had to drag him out of speakeasies and carry him home. Sometimes Jackson became violent.
When he was living with his oldest brother, Charles, and Charles's first wife, Elizabeth, who was a rather difficult woman, very smart and articulate, he came home drunk one night, which was a typical thing to do, and picked up an axe and threatened her with it, and then turned around and sliced right through a painting by his brother that had been promised for exhibition. It was soon after that that Elizabeth, quite understandably, demanded that Charles's younger brother no longer live with them.
Brothers Sandy Pollock arrived in New York in 1934 and took over looking after Jackson. It was the depths of the Depression, and for a while they shared a $10 a week janitorial job. But a government program would change everything.
During the Great Depression, in 1933, the federal government, under the New Deal, brought in a work relief program called the Public Works of Art Project.
The project evolved into the Works Project Administration, or WPA, possibly the most controversial of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's programs to jumpstart the economy.
The WPA Federal Art Project paid artists a wage to work. So they were getting a weekly amount, which was actually $24.86 to do 20 hours of work a week.
Much of the WPA work was representational, but it was also a time for new influences. Muralists like Orozco and Siqueiros particularly impressed Pollock.
He studied with Siqueiros when Siqueiros came to New York. Siqueiros had a kind of hatred of what he called the stick with a few hairs on it, and he tried to get his students away from using brushes and away from conventional techniques. And he taught them, for instance, to do drip painting. People think that Pollock invented it, but he didn't.
The WPA art projects resulted in the creation of thousands of works of art, some of which still endure, many more of which were destroyed or lost.
There's a lot of stuff out there that just has never been located. And every now and again, one of Pollock's pieces will turn up. Some of them have been photographed, so we know what they look like, but they just have not come to light.
But his new job stability did nothing to stop his drinking, and Sandy spent many nights searching bars and gutters for his drunken brother. In desperation, the brothers agreed to hospitalize Jackson in 1938.
He was institutionalized for 6 months at Bloomingdale's, which was a rather nice facility for people with mental diseases.
As soon as he was released, he started drinking again. But he continued therapy, fascinated by what he learned about symbols in the unconscious.
He had been treated by a Jungian analyst in 38, 39, and he was beginning to become interested in archetypes, the symbolism that could be understood across cultures for what Jung called the collective unconscious. He felt that Native American art had a lot of those qualities. So he studied these things and he incorporated them into his work.
Then, in 1939, essentially, he discovered Picasso. There was a big Picasso show at the Museum of Modern Art, and Pollock clearly was just bowled over by it. And all of a sudden, his sketchbooks are full of copies after Picasso, studies inspired by him.
While Jackson was beginning to be influenced by modernism, another young painter, Lee Krasner, had been working with these ideas for some time, and when she first met Pollock, she was unimpressed.
When Jackson Pollock and Lee Krasner first met, they actually had an encounter at a loft party that Pollock did not remember, but Krasner remembered quite well. Evidently, he was drunk. He cut in on her, asked her to dance, stepped all over her feet, and propositioned her. So she basically blew him off.
The socially challenged Pollock never had much luck with women, but his luck turned when he met Lee Krasner. With her love, he would briefly hold the demons at bay, long enough to create paintings the art world had never seen before. Jackson Pollock was a brilliant artist who depended on others to manage his life. Of all the people who helped him, the most important was Lee Krasner, a gifted young New York painter. In 1941, she had a surprise encounter with a bore she'd dismissed 2 years before.
She had broken up with her previous lover a couple of years earlier.
Her artwork was progressing well, and she had been invited to be in a group show.
She looked down the list of artists who were going to be in the show, and it included a few names she recognized, like Picasso and Matisse, but she did not recognize the name Jackson Pollock. So she decided spontaneously to go to his studio, which was only right around the corner from her own place on 8th Street. So she knocked on his door, he let her in, she looked around the studio, and according to her, she was just blown away by what she saw.
You might say it was love at second sight. First sight was the paintings.
Many say the Krasner-Pollock chemistry was complex and extraordinary.
He was as different from her as you could possibly get. Her parents were immigrants and Jewish. He was from the West, Presbyterian. You know, the most exotic country for her, of course, was America west of the Hudson. And I think there was this obviously sexual attraction. He was a handsome and sexual creature, and she was extremely sexual herself.
She had a, fairly voluptuous body. She wasn't particularly attractive. But here was a woman who wanted him, wanted to be with him, and I think that meant the world to him, to have somebody like that. They were somehow meant for each other.
Krasner swooped up Pollock and made him her own, and he found in her all the things he needed: friend, lover, and mother.
Lee was very strong, and I think did in effect replace his mother.
He knew she understood something about what he was trying to do and where he was going.
So she was able to introduce him and able to help him feel that he was not alone in the struggle that he was going through aesthetically.
One key introduction was to Peggy Guggenheim, a society collector and art dealer who'd launched many artists. Her interest was piqued by another painter's comments.
When Peggy Guggenheim was thinking about taking on Jackson, she had an appointment with Pete Mondrian. He comes in and he starts looking at these paintings on the floor. And she said, "Oh, Pete, that's not your sort of thing. Come on, we have an appointment." He said, "Just a minute." He said, "This may be one of the most original young Americans that I have ever seen."
Peggy Guggenheim, she ended up putting him on contract and taking most of his work.
Lee's help was both strategic and practical.
Peggy Guggenheim was fairly arrogant and much richer and more spoiled than Lee. And she had Lee licking stamps, addressing envelopes to, a mailing list and so forth.
Gradually, the work of taking care of Jackson replaced painting as Lee's career.
She made a commitment that her first job was to help him make his art and then to promote it. And making her own art was just the secondary thing.
Lee believed that Jackson would drink less if they left the city. They found a small farmhouse in Springs, Long Island, and Lee persuaded Peggy Guggenheim to lend them money to buy it.
She made them a loan of $2,000. She was paying him a stipend to paint so that he wouldn't have to have outside work, and she increased that so that he would have enough money to live on. And they bought this house. It cost them $5,000 altogether, which was a great deal of money in 1945, especially if you didn't have it.
Lee and Jackson married that October and moved to Springs the next month.
The best period of their lives was that first years in Springs. As difficult as you and I would have found them in terms of just not having heat, and not having plumbing, and not having this and that. It was very difficult that way, but in some ways that too was a distraction from the demons that pursued him.
When money was tight, they grew vegetables and dug clams out of the bay for food. But the expansive sky and fields around them charged Jackson's painting with new energy.
He grew up in the country, was finally back in the country, He really, I think, appreciated nature deeply, and it was freeing for him. It was air, and Lee was protecting him out there.
Nature played a very, very prominent role in their work as a kind of elemental force in a visible way. The energy of nature, the growing, generative feeling that you get from nature, from the change of the seasons, from the elements themselves, those are present.
In some ways, those paintings just seem like chunks of lawn folded up onto the wall, but they're not really. It's painting, it's art, and they're not pictures of grass. What they are is very dense webs of brushwork.
Pollock's style was about to undergo another alteration when he relocated his studio in 1946.
Got the barn fixed up so he could paint in it. He had a place to go work that was very private. You know, painting is the little painting that I've done. The one thing that you do realize, it's a really private experience.
There was another financial challenge when Peggy Guggenheim decided to close her gallery in 1947. She turned Jackson over to a new dealer, Betty Parsons.
Betty Parsons could not afford to pay him a stipend. So for a couple of years there, he was dependent entirely on proceeds from sales. And they were very, very hard up during that time.
Despite their poverty, Jackson was enormously productive, beginning to work in a way that would change Western art forever. He put his canvas on the floor and launched the paint through the air.
One of the most amazing things about Jackson's technique is the incredible variety he got from this simple act of pouring paint. He used different implements so he could get different kinds of lines, and he used different consistencies of paint for the same reason.
He allowed the swirls of paint to go beyond that shape and left markings on the floor. And you can see where the canvas was when those paintings were made.
And in 1948, a bike accident brought on another change. After a particularly nasty spill, Lee took him to see a local doctor.
He encountered a local physician, just a general practitioner named Edwin Heller. Jackson would never tell her exactly what it was that Heller told him or how he managed to control his drinking, but he did.
It became the most productive time of his life.
People assumed that because his paintings looked wild and uncontrolled, that they were the result of him being wild and uncontrolled, that the crazy paintings are the expression of the crazy life. That's just wrong. The crazy-looking paintings come out of the 3 years of his life when he was the most sober and most controlled.
In 1948, the world was ready for an art star. Post-war Americans had money to spend, and the magazines that defined taste needed someone to promote.
Clement Greenberg was the art critic for The Nation, and he had followed Pollock from quite early on, already with his kind of surrealist pictures of the mid-1940s. He had recognized Pollock as someone of exceptional talent.
Greenberg and Pollock had become friends, though the non-verbal painter was very unlike the cerebral critic.
Well, what happens is artists need critics because critics help explain the art to the people who show and buy the paintings.
And when Life magazine wanted to write an article in 1949 about the modernist painters that were stirring up the American scene, they called Greenberg.
Clement Greenberg and others were saying that there was this group of new American artists who were really more important than what was happening in Paris at the time. And Jackson's right in the middle, and it's an important moment in the emergence of abstract expressionism.
As a result of the Life magazine article, Pollock's 1949 show at the Betty Parsons Gallery sold out. With earnings of $6,500 that year, almost double the average white-collar salary of $3,500, he was the best-paid avant-garde artist in America. But in Pollock's good fortune were the seeds of his downfall, which would be swift and sure. Once fame struck for Jackson Pollock, things began to change rapidly in the house in Springs.
Here in this house, when I first came, there was a huge stack of the issue of Life magazine in which they asked the question as the headline, is he the greatest painter in America?
And that was just a start. In the spotlight, Pollock found himself in many uncomfortable situations.
When he did the radio interview, he did a well-known radio interview, these were scripted for him. Robert Motherwell wrote the answers.
Here, in this rare radio interview from 1950, is Jackson Pollock's voice.
The thing that interests me is that today painters do not have to go to a subject matter outside of themselves. Most modern painters work from a different source. They work from within.
Can you imagine what kind of phony you feel when the answers you're giving, or you're just reading from a script and you barely understand them?
In the rush of fame, Pollock sometimes belittled other artists, including some who had helped him.
Pollock was very dismissive of Benton's influence, and I always thought that that was kind of unfortunate because he owed Benton a lot. But he called him a strong personality to react against. Now, if that's the best you can say about a teacher who was a mentor and a father figure and a supporter, I don't think that's very generous at all.
Ominously, Pollock found it increasingly difficult to paint. His breaking point came unexpectedly when a celebrated photographer, Hans Namuth, decided to make a film of Pollock painting. For the shy Pollock, the project became more difficult as the weeks went on.
It really wore on Pollock, I think. First of all, he wasn't painting for himself, he was painting for the camera. You know, I did some actually pretty interesting work in that film, but I can imagine that the ordeal of doing this every weekend and having this appointment, more or less, to paint, being told we're out of film now, you can stop painting, was bewildering to him. And it just got to the boiling point, you know, when they finally finished on, I think it was Thanksgiving Day.
It was telling Jackson how to do it, when to start. It all had to fit on the film. And all of a sudden you have this poor guy, this artist who already feels like a phony. He already feels like he's doing a lot of this at this point in his life too much by rote just to satisfy the market. And he is taking orders and doing this as if he's sort of
it's all a fake.
It's all a fake.
It's all a fake.
And I think by the end of that long, cold afternoon, Pollock was frustrated and freezing and felt like he really needed a drink.
And he goes right in and takes not just one, but several big drinks. And Lee knows the end has come. So they sit down, a table laden with food, quite a few friends, and Jackson starts taunting Namuth, the photographer, saying, I'm not a phony, you're a phony. I'm not a phony, you're a phony. More and more aggressive. And at one point, he takes the edge of the table, and he's quite a strong guy, pulls it up and turns it over, and all the food flies all over the room.
Lee's comment, of course, always Lee in control, says, coffee will be served in the living room.
Like any drunk, it was a great excuse to get drunk again. He never stopped drinking after that.
The most productive part of his career starts when he stops drinking, and it begins to come to an end at the moment when he falls off the wagon at the end of 1950 and starts drinking again. And from there on, it's all downhill.
When his November 1950 show opened at the Betty Parsons Gallery, Pollock was full of dread. Many of his new paintings were huge and expensive. 2 were priced at $7,500. A friend had warned him they were too big and wouldn't sell.
When he showed all what we now consider the masterpieces, Autumn Rhythm, Lavender Mist, One, the paintings that are in major museum collections today, the show didn't sell.
But at the opening, Jackson was already drunk and disappeared into the night before it was over.
Then in '51, of course, he showed very, very different work. He went back to using figurative imagery, he eliminated color, painted just in black on unprimed canvas, and these works were not well received. But he had to change. He knew he couldn't continue repeating himself.
This change was so radical that virtually none of this work sold.
Most artists feel comfortable coming up with a minor innovation from one work to the other, and it's seen as an evolution, and the work all forms a coherent whole. Jackson felt that each new work had to be something new, and that's an enormous burden for an artist to bear.
I think when an artist begins to pay attention to what people expect from them as opposed to what they are searching for within themselves, it's pretty deadly.
As the disappointments piled up, Pollock escaped more and more into liquor, frequently meeting his friends at the Cedar Bar and drinking until it closed.
People actually expected it. They would go to the Cedar Bar hoping to see Jackson act like Jackson. It was a circus act that he was expected to perform, and it really was one of the things that made the last few years of his life so miserable, because he was constantly being expected to perform, either to act out in aggressive, drunken ways, or, on the other hand, to create some extraordinary masterpiece of Western civilization.
Some of his drunken acting out endangered others, too.
Well, I can remember once when we went to the Cedar, and he said, you know, Paul, I've got a car. You want to go for a drive? And he was, to put it mildly, 3 sheets to the wind.
Desperate in 1953, Lee called on Jackson's mother to help.
Lee's solution is to actually bring the original problem to Springs, and she calls for and says, send mother here. Yeah. Jackson needs her.
Though Jackson often fell apart when his mother was near, this time her presence seemed stabilizing. He started painting again and made one of his last masterpieces, The Deep.
The Deep is, in some ways, a kind of fantastic one-off, a rare triumph at the end of Pollock's career. There's this big black gash in between the areas of white, this dramatic opening as though you were walking through a cliff-like landscape and there was opening, but not opening into light, opening into darkness.
But as soon as his mother left, Jackson slid back into drunkenness. His brothers refused to let Stella Pollock visit again.
He had alienated his own family. The success, the primary benefit of which was to win his family's affection, was in fact driving his family away. So he couldn't win for losing. They still felt to the day they died that Charles was the better artist.
For Jackson, this added fuel to his self-destructive fires. But there was worse to come. By 1955, Jackson Pollock was drinking more and painting less. Some said his powers were slipping, and one of his warmest supporters had abandoned him. Clement Greenberg, whom Jackson thought was a friend, used words like forced and dressed up to describe Jackson's new work.
He felt that Jackson was losing his stuff. He had this theory that artists have a run, and that Jackson had had his run. It was a terrifying blow, and it was one of the things from which he never really recovered.
Jackson's marriage to Lee was becoming strained. She was starting to show her work, but still found herself in Jackson's shadow. She began to feel neglected and discontent.
At first, she felt this enormous sense of accomplishment. His paintings were, in a sense, her paintings. But I think over time, the full satisfaction began to fade, and there was mixed in, increasingly, a feeling, but what about me?
Pollock's health was failing. After breaking his ankle while roughhousing with a friend, the painter and drinking buddy Willem de Kooning, he had gained 50 pounds and begun wearing a stubbly beard. He was bloated from liver damage. He grew increasingly erratic.
He drew the bow and the arrow and sunk it into the kitchen wall. Well, Lee was very composed. She didn't say a word.
As his disintegration continued, he turned to yet another psychiatrist.
His very last psychiatrist said, basically, what you really need to do, Jackson, is do anything you want. If it feels good, you do it. So that, of course, inevitably led to this sort of misbehavior in the Cedar Bar, etc.
Jackson started to date other women, and sometimes even brought them to places where he knew Lee would see them.
When things turned sour, when Jackson started to wander and started to drink again and started to abuse her and started to cheat on her, that all that resentment that had been building up through all those years of deference really did come down.
By 1956, Jackson had quit painting and his marriage was in a shambles. He was openly dating a young woman. In despair, Lee fled to Paris.
I was trying to persuade him to come to Paris because the Europeans considered him a great painter. And he put his head down and then he looked up at me and said, Paul, it's too late. And I thought to myself, my God, this man is 44 years old. How can he say it's too late?
Lee, too, tried at the last minute to alter fate.
As she was boarding the ship, she was on the Queen Elizabeth, going to Europe, she ran down from the gangplank and went to the phone, and she got him on the phone. She said, oh, Jackson, I think I left my passport. Could you look for it? And they talked for a while. She kept trying to get him, basically, to convince her not to go, to say, don't go, don't go. And nothing happened.
And she chose to go away and said, you know, I'm going to give you time to sort things out, I think was her phrase to Jackson.
Lee sailed to France, and Jackson tried to console himself with his girlfriend, who was staying at the house in Springs.
She went reluctantly. And even though Jackson wouldn't beg her to stay for his own reasons. After she left, of course, she was all he could think about. And even at one point went out to a flower shop and sent her roses at the hotel in Paris. And of course the roses came and she was just overcome. So here they were still locked in this embrace from opposite sides of the Atlantic.
But the embrace was fast slipping away.
Jackson was thinking about his life and thinking about what it all amounted to and missing her. And there's a wonderful moment when he goes out with his friend Conrad Marcarelli, who was really a neighbor, into the night and looks at the sky and says, everything is so beautiful, the sky is so beautiful, the world is so beautiful. Why is it all I can think about is death?
The next night, on August 11th, 1956, at 10:15 p.m., a drunken Jackson drove at 75 miles an hour up the narrow, curving, tree-lined road to his home.
He lost control on an oil kind of packed road going back. He was going very fast. Car swerved across the other side of the road. He tried to correct it, hit a tree, spun around, car flipped, bam.
Jackson's girlfriend was thrown free and lived. A visitor, Edith Metzger, was pinned underneath and crushed by the car. Jackson, 44 years old, was thrown 50 feet in the air, head first, into a slender birch tree that split his skull and crushed his brain.
I don't think he committed suicide, but I don't think he prevented himself from crashing that vehicle. That particular night, I think he was beyond caring.
That night, Lee was staying in Paris with their friend Paul Jenkins.
Clem called and said, "Is Lee there?" I said, "Yes, she is." It was in the morning. He said, "Now stay calm. But Jackson has been killed. He had an automobile accident. But please, handle this. At which point, Lee divined what we were saying on the phone and screamed, "Jackson is dead," and headed for my balcony.
She started shrieking like an animal. She started banging into the wall. She practically tried to jump off the balcony. He was afraid she would.
I just put the phone down and took Lee in my arms, and I took her across the room, and we leaned into the wall. And when she finally was calm, and she said, "I've got to go back," I said, I know.
Lee returned home stoically to bury Jackson under a huge uncarved boulder in a cemetery near their home.
It wasn't just her husband, it was her entire being. And she went into a kind of mourning that lasted the rest of her life. It was a creative mourning and a productive mourning, but she never really
ferocious mourning
got over it.
Lee Krasner Pollock would live and paint for another 20 years, winning fame in her own right and brilliantly managing the sale of Pollock's remaining paintings.
Instead of maximizing the sales to make herself a rich woman, she doled those paintings out very carefully to the right museum.
When Lee died, she left an estate worth more than $20 million.
She established a foundation with her money and with her artistic legacy that gives grants to needy and worthy artists. Friends of mine who knew her call this Lee's WPA.
The legacy of the unhappy young man who struggled to draw and the woman painter who loved his genius now inspires and supports the art of future generations.
They were artists first and foremost, and that shaped everything they did. Very often that gets lost in a romantic tale. And there was romance in it, and a lot of conflict, and a lot of drama. But the drama revolved around their lives as artists, given the limitations under which they were working, and the hostile climate in which they were developing their art, that they managed to triumph in spite of it. And that's a wonderful story.